So this week's lecture is going to be on behaviorism. So behaviorism can fall under can be divided into two categories. There's classical conditioning, which Pavlov and Watson were the theorists who did research in this area. They're known for classical conditioning. Operant conditioning is theorists that you want to think about for operant conditioning are Thorndike and Skinner. So a little bit about Ivan Pavlov. He was a physiologist. He used conditioning to gain a predictable response from a stimulus. He was famous for his behavioral experiment with dogs, where when he would ring a bell, he would bring food to the dog. And so every time he would do that, he would ring a bell, have food for the dog. And so each time the dog would salivate because of the food that he would bring. Well, then he started just ringing the bell without the food. And as soon as he would ring the bell, the dog would start salivating. The dog was conditioned to behave in a way that as soon as he heard the bell, he knew that food was coming, so he immediately salivated. And here is just a fun video that I found that gives an example of classical conditioning. Those of you who may have had a roommate,
never compromise, not in your work, not in.
Those of you who might have had a roommate when you were in college will probably appreciate this. Sorry, I'm having problems here.
Hey Psych 101 class, I'm David and I'm going to be testing Pavlov's theory of classical conditioning on my roommate Brian. The conditioned stimulus will be the sound effect.
That was easy.
And then I'm going to shoot him with this airsoft gun. He will soon learn the relationship between the sound effect and the shot before he gets too hurt.
That was easy. That was easy.
Ah!
That was easy.
Look.
That was easy. That was easy.
Alright guys, looks like Pavlov's theory worked.
All right, so that was just a fun example showing an example of conditioning. His poor roommate, every time he eventually got conditioned to the point where when he would hear the easy button, he would start to flinch because he was afraid that his friend would shoot him with the Nerf gun. John Watson was a psychologist, and he is actually one of the key researchers of behaviorism. So Pavlov and Watson, these are the theorists, these are the names that you want to, that you should refer to conditioning whenever you're thinking of classical conditioning. He was famous for his infant research and his little Albert experiment. Now, this was before we had our institutional review board reviewing all research to make sure that that participants were not, that nothing harmful was being done to them. And so in this particular little Albert experiment, so of course now if this experiment was ever sent to the IRB board, it would not get approved. So poor little Albert loved rats. He thought they were cute, they were furry, and so before the conditioning happened, baby Albert, he's allowed to play with a pet rat, loves the pet rat. However, Albert was scared of loud noises. So during the conditioning process, every time that Albert would come to pet the rat, Watson would make a loud noise, which scared Albert. And doing this over and over again, he repeated it many, many times until Albert was eventually conditioned to the point where when he was presented the when he was presented the rat, Albert became scared and he cried away. He cried and moved away from the rabbit. So he became conditioned into realizing that the white rat was related to the loud noise. So main points of classical conditioning deals with reflexes or certain responses that are evoked from a specific stimulus. What kind of response, what kind of behavior are you wanting maybe your students to do after performing some type of, or after giving some type of stimulus? So people can be trained to perform a certain task or response by providing some type of trigger. It could be a sound, a picture, a phrase, etc. So when you see this, what do you think of? Okay, we've all been conditioned to know that these golden arcs are McDonald's. Okay, we've been conditioned to think of McDonald's when we see this. Are you salivating yet? Probably not, but so classroom implications for this. If we are consistent and repetitive with stimuli, your students will learn to behave properly through classical conditioning. Think about the beginning of the year, those of you who are already in the classroom. If you're not in the classroom, one of those very important things you'll always hear to make sure that you give those clear expectations at the beginning of the school year so you know, your students know what's expected of them. Go over those classroom routines. Maybe there is a time that maybe your signal for getting your students back to attention, if you could hear my voice, clap once, and students should stop what they're doing and clap once. If you hear my voice, clap twice. Students will then clap twice. Or maybe it's turning off the lights. You want to condition your students to be quiet whenever you turn off the lights, etc. Here's some more examples. So let's say if you had an activity and it's time, or some type of experiment, and it's time for the students to clean up. So before your students have been conditioned, if you, the teacher, starts counting down from 20, your students will probably just look at you and think, why are you counting down from 20? They have no idea what's going on. So the students most likely will not clean up. But if you tell the students to clean up, they will clean up. So during the conditioning process, what you as the teacher, what you would do, you would tell this class to clean up, and then you start counting down from 20. And then your students will clean up. So we do this over and over again until they get into the routine. Continue that repetition, doing this multiple days in a row until your students are finally conditioned to the point where all you have to do is start counting down from 20 and your students will clean up. Their behavior has been conditioned. So just think about those things, just signals that you can use, just nonchalant behaviors that you can use to make your students perform in a certain way. Again, my example, if you're wanting the students to quiet down, if you tell the students to quiet down, they'll probably quiet down. If you clap 3 times just random before you even tell them what you're doing, they probably will not get quiet unless they've had this same type of expectation in another class. If you need to condition them for this behavior, you would clap 3 times and tell the class to quiet down, and then they will get quiet. And so repeating that over and over again, they would eventually be conditioned to where you clap 3 times and then they would be quiet. So students' behavior has been conditioned. So these are all examples of classical conditioning. So as we are reading about behaviorism, just think for a minute, how could you use classical conditioning in your classroom in order to help your students behave properly? So The next phase of behaviorism that we'll move into is operant conditioning. And one of the famous theorists who are very well known for operant conditioning is Thorndike. He was a psychologist and he created the law of effect, which is central to Thorndike's theory. So the law of effect emphasizes the consequences of behavior. So responses resulting in satisfying or rewarding consequences are learned, and responses producing annoying consequences are not learned. So if a student behaves in a certain way, if they're rewarded for it, well then they're having a learned behavior. And if they are punished for something, well then the consequences are not learned. So this is a function account of learning because satisfiers allow individuals to adapt in their environment. B.F. Skinner is probably a psychologist who you've heard in the past. He developed the well-known behavioral theory of operant conditioning.